Hello everyone, it's Skill Up here. I wanted to say hello firstly, hope you're all doing well. And secondly, I just wanted to talk a little bit today about something that came up yesterday during my review of the Deadeye gear set. So a lot of people really liked that review and a lot of people didn't really like it. And one of the biggest reasons that a lot of people didn't like it was because I was really actively calling for Sentry's call to be nerfed during that video. And a lot of people hate when I call for nerfs. And that's really understandable, to be honest with you, because obviously a lot of people feel that that nerfs aren't really sort of respectful of their time and a recognition of the time that they've invested. Since you very often invest hundreds of hours to perfect your build only to have it suddenly taken away from you by nerfs, right? So I get that, I absolutely do. And a lot of these people also felt like the game is already so difficult with these really bullet spongy enemies, so why the hell would anyone want to make it more difficult by removing something like Sentry's Call? So both of these things are actually really fair points, and it probably stems from the fact that I wasn't really clear on the reasons why I wanted Sentry's Call nerfed. So I wanted to elaborate on that so you guys don't think I'm just some jerk who doesn't value your time and who just wants to make the game more difficult than it already is. So I kind of just want to set the record straight on all of that today. Let's start from the very beginning. So this game right now in patch 1.3 is really badly tuned. Enemy health is way too high, and in particular, enemies deal way too much damage. With 500k toughness, I'm still extremely squishy against a level 35 enemy, with most shotgunners being able to pretty much one-shot me if they are within about 15 meters of me. Similarly, even with about 200k DPS, which is what I can generally reasonably expect to achieve with around 268 gear, I'm still fairly weak, or at least I feel really weak. It usually requires at least 1.5 magazines for me to drop a target in most instances. Now I know that's not the case for a lot of you. You're rocking these massive builds and you 350k dupes and whatever. I get that, that's cool, but I mean the vast majority of players who are playing this game right now are really struggling with their damage throughput. Generally speaking, all of us are forced to gear and mod for a huge amount of toughness before we reach the point where we can feel somewhat comfortable in the game, right? Which actually has a really negative effect on build diversity. Generally speaking, if I'm strong enough to survive an enemy, I probably don't have enough DPS to kill that enemy in a reasonable space of time. And if I do have enough DPS to kill that enemy quickly, then I probably don't have enough toughness to survive that enemy while I'm doing that. So the balance at either end of the spectrum is really stuffed. So I fully acknowledge this reality, and the absolute last thing that I would want to do as a player of this game is make that any worse, because I fully recognize that it really blows at the moment. So why then would I call for a nerf on Sentry's Call, which is a gear set that massively increases my power and gives me a really like a fighting chance against these enemies? Put simply, I believe that there are three very potent forces at play in the division that force Massive to tune their enemies to the point where they have these really high health pools and ridiculous damage amounts. And those three forces are Smart Cover, Pulse, and Sentry's Call. I've actually always held that these things were the three biggest problems with the division, but I've never really taken the time to explain why, so today I wanted to do that. Each of these things, Pulse, Sentry's Call, and Smart Cover, multiply and amplify your damage spectacularly, right? Pulse gives you 40% crit and 10% base damage. It gives you 100% critical hit damage on top of that. Sentry's Call gives you 30% damage to elites, 20% headshot damage, and 52% bonus damage to you and your team, while Smart Cover increases your total damage up to 50%, while it reduces your total damage taken, or not total, but it reduces your damage taken by up to 75%, and there's some funky math that works in the background behind that, but I'm not going to explain that now. It's worth noting that with enough electronics, I get 100% uptime on these abilities. They are literally never not up when it comes to Pulse and Smart Cover, right? They're just always there so long as I'm either built for it or I'm running with someone who is. Now, they're obviously really big numbers, what I've just listed. They are literally providing you with more stats and damage than your actual base gear does. And in my view, these three things are the number one reason for the imbalance in the game that we see today. Many people who responded negatively to my calls for nerfs see these things that give you power as the solution to the problem, right? But in my view, these things are the problem themselves. As a developer, it's Massive's job to create content for all sorts of players, both casual and hardcore. And by the way, casual doesn't mean shit. It just means that you have less time to play than a hardcore player who drops like 20 hours plus into the game each week. I run with casual players all the time in matchmaking and whatever, we're just chatting away, and the vast majority of players that I play with that don't play a lot of the game are still first-class players. But it does mean that when you're casually playing, you have less time to play, and it means you're generally a little bit further behind on the gear curve. And that's a lot, you know, it's also a lot harder for you to invest big hours into breaking through really challenging endgame content, since a wipe after like 45 minutes on Heroic Underground could mean that your entire session that you've set aside that day or that night has been wasted. So on the hardcore end of the spectrum, Massive need to make their game challenging, otherwise we'll all get bored and leave. And I say we here because absolutely I come at this from the perspective of a hardcore player. And I really do apologize, you know, if it ever appears as though I'm not paying enough attention to the perspectives of more casual players, but I need to be honest and say that that experience is so removed from my own that I would be lying if I said I fully understood what it's like for a casual player to play this game, because I know it's really, really tough. So for hardcore players though, you know, if we just like slice through enemies like a hot knife through butter or whatever, you know, we won't really feel challenged, we won't feel engaged, and if we'll sort of end up getting all of the gear that we want in absolutely no time at all. So just like in any other game, the right difficulty curve is a really important objective in keeping your hardcore players engaged. So how do you make content difficult? Well, obviously there's a lot of ways to do that, but clearly Massive is going down the path of having these unstoppable juggernaut enemies rather than having, say, enemies that, you know, like more enemies or more complex mechanics for each of those enemies for us to contend with, other options like that. You know, more health and more damage is what Massive are currently driving towards. So if that's the case, then the obvious question becomes, how much health and damage do these enemy units need to have to really challenge a hardcore endgame player? And here's where we get to the really important part. When it comes to tuning enemy health and damage, Massive must assume that players are properly geared and that they are making use of all of the buffs and abilities that are available in the game while they are playing in groups. This means that teams of players are having their damage amplified in a huge way by Smart Cover, Pulse, and Sentry's Call. And if Massive didn't tune for these things, then organized groups would simply stack all of these buffs, crunch through the content in seconds, and then complain about it being too easy. So let's talk about an actual example of this to demonstrate. So let's say you're Massive, right? And you want to be able to make it so that enemies in your game, you know, can take about 3 seconds of continuous fire to kill, right? That sounds about right. Shooting a gun for 3 seconds, the enemy drops. That feels right, okay? So let's say the player's base DPS is 100 DPS, right? So if I was Massive and I want to ensure that the target drops in 3 seconds, I need to give that enemy 300 health. And of course that makes sense. Okay, now let's give you, the player, 40% crit from Pulse, 10% damage from Tactical Pulse, 100% critical hit damage from Pulse, 52% damage from Sentry, 30% damage to Elites from Sentry's 5-piece bonus, and 50% damage Smart Cover, right? Let's give you all of those buffs. That same mob will now need to have 1200 health for it to survive 3 seconds against one player. And now let's multiply that by 4 to assume that the mob can last 3 seconds while 4 players are shooting at it. And that mob that had 300 damage at the very start of this now has 4800 damage, or health I should say, to ensure that it has enough health to survive just 3 seconds against a team of properly configured players, which is an increase of 1600% versus the base health of that mob. So forgetting about the group multiplier, if a mob had 1200 health and if I was an unbuffed player with 100 DPS, it would take me 12 seconds of continuous fire to bring that target down. Now let's be really generous and say that you're bringing like a fully buffed Pulse to the table, which a lot of us will do. then that would bring your DPS to around 200 DPS, meaning that it would take you about 6 seconds of continuous fire to bring your target down. Now, anyone playing at the moment knows that 6 seconds is about the length of time that it takes for you to kill a target, which is about 1.5 magazines. So already we're getting a sense that these numbers, which are totally made up right now, are actually a fairly accurate reflection of in-game performance. Now, this might be okay, 6 seconds to kill an enemy, but for the flip side problem, which is 6 seconds is more than enough time for any enemy in the game to crunch you twice unless you are stacking like 600 or 700k toughness. Again, a similar example, let's say I have 100 health, and I, as massive, want my NPCs to be able to kill you, the player, in 4 bullets, right? Then I need each bullet to deal 25 damage, right? That's simple. Only players are now all stacking the max armor cap. So that actually means that in order for the NPC to deal 25 damage to you, they actually need to deal closer to 100 damage per bullet. So bad luck to anyone not stacking the armor cap at that point. Now we can add smart cover to the mix, which increases your damage resilience by up to 75%. In order to achieve 25 damage on you to kill you in 4 bullets while you're in smart cover, that mob needs to do a base damage of around 300 to 400 per shot, depending on the math that you want to employ when it comes to damage mitigation, right? And that's because you're fully armor stacked and you're fully in cover, right? In smart cover. Which is, of course, it's like 400 damage is enough damage to confidently one-shot you when you are not in smart cover, even if you are at the mitigation cap. And this is before we think about things like protection from elites or, stamina stacking or, all these sorts of things that go towards making us quite tanky, even beyond what I've already discussed, okay? So my point is, it's very easy for mobs to kill us in the game because, again, the developers have to assume that a lot of the time we are running around with smart cover and we still need to take a reasonable amount of damage in smart cover, otherwise we would just sit in there forever and be totally invulnerable. Now, obviously, the math in these examples is highly oversimplified, but the core concepts that underpin it are very clear. Because I get all of these sources of damage multiplication and mitigation, massive need to tune damage dealt and damage received to accommodate these things, which means that when I have these damage multipliers and mitigants active, I'm fine, right? But when I don't, such as when I'm playing solo or I'm with a group of match-made players who are not synergizing their buffs correctly, then I feel extremely weak. I don't do enough damage and I don't feel powerful enough at any point, and I get one shot by the first NPC that looks at me when my group is not optimally set up to take advantage of all of these buffs. And I think we've all felt this, like when we're rolling with a proper group, we can generally handle most things that are thrown at us. Because we're getting all of these buffs. But when we're solo, there's absolutely no way that we can do any content that will actually progress our characters because it's all so massively overtuned, not just for groups, but for players who are bringing these buffs that are amplifying their damage and their mitigation by such crazy amounts. So the obvious point here may be that this is Massive's design. That Massive, they want us to do hard endgame content in group. They want to really lean into the squad-based mechanics of this RPG shooter. And look, it's a really fair point, but I'd argue that the current gap between what you can and can't do based on your buffs and your gear is so large at the moment that it's pushing away a huge portion of the player base and making it impossible for anyone to play solo and enjoy themselves while they're doing it. Sentry, Pulse, and Smart Cover amplify damage and mitigation too much and create too far a delta between those that have those buffs and those that don't. Each of these buffs should be bringing 5% more power to the table, not 50%. This is how pretty much any other MMO ever has done it, and it's worked perfectly. If content was properly tuned and I got a total of, say, 20% extra damage by being fully buffed up by my group, then that would be really awesome, because as a solo player, I can still kind of kill an enemy that has 20% more health than your average enemy, right? It will just take me a little bit longer to do that. I can't, however, confidently kill an enemy that has 300% more health than your average enemy, and I sure as hell can't kill a whole pack of them without it taking 10 minutes and my entire ammo reserves. So there are two really important things that I want to say here before I wrap up on this. And the first is that I'm sure a lot of people are thinking that the answer to this problem is simply more power buffs. Like buff everything, buff weapons, buff gear, buff abilities, buff talents, buff consumables, buff everything, right? but you really can't achieve balance that way. Like, a lot of people point to Diablo as an example of success here. That's a game that's achieved really interesting and functional game balance by simply piling more and more player power onto their players. But there's one important difference here, and that's Diablo is not a PvP game. You can't just buff everything in a PvP game and expect it not to break. Any balanced PvP game is a very finely tuned machine. A difference of like 1 or 2% damage on a weapon can mean the difference between the 4th bullet of that weapon killing you versus not killing you. That's a very big deal, right? Just from a 1 or 2% tweak on base weapon damage. Balance must be very precise in a PvP game, and it must come with a mix of buffs and nerfs. So while I agree that if this were just PvE, right, that you know, buffing everything would be totally fine because no one gets hurt, right? It's just NPCs. Who cares if they die really fast and we're all God mode? But in PvP, it just simply doesn't work that way, and the game would be less playable than it is now. And that's not to say that lots of buffs aren't in order. I definitely think that a lot of gear sets need to be buffed. I definitely think that a lot of the abilities in the game are borderline useless. Like, there's tons of buffs that we do need across the board, but I think before that, we need to look at the huge power increases that we are getting from these 3 things in particular, because they just create too much of a gap between those that have them and those that don't. And finally, you know, in all of this that I'm suggesting here, I'm absolutely not calling an end to group content that demands, you know, the right configuration and synergy. Like, I do want enemies with 4 times the base amount of health because I really want challenging group-oriented content that players would never be able to complete solo. But what I also want is plenty of solo experiences that are properly tuned and give me the opportunity to progress my character, you know, when I'm not in a group, because I don't always want a group. Sometimes I just want to rock it solo and still move forward with my character's progression. So when I call for a Sentry nerf, what I'm really calling for is balance to this game and an end to the crazy inflated health pools of enemies that are necessitated by all of the damage and mitigation amplifying talents and abilities and gear sets in this game. We need to be more powerful by virtue of the gear and playstyle choices that we make, but we need this to be kept within strict parameters, otherwise there's no way that a solo player will be able to confidently grind the Dark Zone or the Heroic Underground, and obviously that would just straight up suck. So, I apologize if I wasn't clearer about this before. In fact, I do apologize because I wasn't clearer when I was calling for nerfs. Again, I know how much it sucks to see stuff nerfed, but I can promise you that what I want for this game is for it to be more playable than it currently is. And in my view, this issue, these 3 things more than any others, are having the largest impact on messing with the overall metagame and are the biggest things holding the game back. People are always asking me like, hey, Skill Up, can you make a video that explains like how you would fix the game? I'm not really into that sort of stuff, to be honest with you. I'm more interested in exploring what's here now and understanding it more deeply. But if I was to make any video, this is the video, right? This is what I would say. Fix these 3 things, because it's impossible for Massive to properly balance a game when I can get like hundreds of % more DPS by using these 3 things, because that's just crazy. If Massive can get this part right, it's going to mean a completely different experience, both with more rewarding and balanced group play and a solo experience that's actually possible and worthy of our time. So I'd love to hear your perspectives on this in the comments below. I know talk of nerfs on my channel is always met with a lot of hostility, and again, I respect that fully. I'm not disregarding your opinions on that at all. So I would actually be interested to hear what you think of what I've said. You know, I think we're all after the same thing here. Like, we all play this game. A lot of us bought the season pass. We all want our money's worth, or we just love the game and we know that the bones of it are really good. We just want the whole package to be better, and we all want this like thriving game and this thriving community. And I'd really love to hear your suggestions on like how we could get there, because obviously this is a very important discussion to have at this time. I really would just like to hear what you have to say. So let me know. But thank you very much for listening. I hope you found this video useful and that it you know, it sort of clarified my perspective. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen to it. I appreciate your time as always. Until next time, guys, take good care, and I will see you in the Dark Zone. Bye-bye.